Pesto's meticulous nature was evident in every aspect of her life. Political documents were neatly stacked on her home office desk, and her court attire was always laid out the night before. But today, Karoline wasn't heading to the White House, where she usually commanded authority as President Donald Trump's spokesperson. Instead, she had a personal matter to address at the Pesto Municipal Court, a contract dispute involving her family's used truck dealership, which she believed had been misinterpreted. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest updates. Karoline opted for a more relaxed look than her usual power suits, a crisp navy blazer over a white blouse paired with black slacks. Standing before her bathroom mirror, she tied back her blonde hair with practiced precision. At 27, she carried the confidence of someone who had spent years working alongside Trump and educating herself on legal matters through campaign documents. Just a quick court appearance, she reminded herself, grabbing a banana and a thermal mug filled with fresh coffee. In the garage, her BMW, a personal reward for her role in Trump's election victory, waited. She loved the car, though she sometimes noticed the surprised glances of strangers when they saw a young woman step out of such a luxury vehicle. Traffic in Pesto moved at its usual sluggish pace, but Karoline wasn't concerned. She had given herself ample time to reach the courthouse. She switched on NPR, letting the morning news play as she mentally reviewed the paperwork for the case. The dispute stemmed from a truck maintenance contract her family had signed with a local company, but discrepancies in payment terms had led to a legal disagreement. To strengthen her argument, she had taken photos of all relevant documents. As she drove, her car's Bluetooth system chimed, an incoming call. The screen displayed the name Michael Reynolds, Senior Political Advisor, White House. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. A direct call from Michael at this hour could only mean something urgent. "Karoline, sorry to call so early." Michael's voice came through the speakers, slightly rushed. "We've got an issue with the President's Gulf of America decree. The press is in a frenzy, and I need you to review our response ASAP." Karoline's heart pounded. The decree, renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, was one of Trump's most controversial moves, and she was the designated media liaison for it. "How long do I have?" she asked, already shifting into crisis management mode. "Before noon. I'm emailing you the documents now. Can you review them and call me back?" "Got it." Karoline's tone remained composed, though her mind was racing. She had planned to arrive at the courthouse early, allowing time to locate the right courtroom. Now she had to improvise. Spotting a small coffee shop, she pulled into a parking space, retrieved her laptop, and connected to her phone's hotspot. The press inquiries were sharp, requiring legally sound, strategic responses. She meticulously analyzed the talking points, taking detailed notes to ensure her reply was flawless. Time slipped by. When she glanced at her watch, her stomach dropped. It was nearly time for court, and she was still 10 minutes away. Quickly, she called Michael back, gave him a brief summary of her recommendations, and promised a more detailed response after her hearing. Back in traffic, Karoline focused on staying calm. She had never been late for a press briefing or event. It was against her nature. But she also knew that as White House press secretary, her responsibilities couldn't be ignored. The Gulf of America issue was a high-stakes matter, shaping Trump's image and influencing millions of supporters. That morning's response would be crucial. Finally, she arrived at the Pesto Municipal Court parking lot, a few minutes behind schedule. As she hurried toward the building, her phone buzzed. A message from Michael Reynolds. "Your quick analysis was spot on. Thanks for prioritizing this." Karoline allowed herself a small smile. At least the delay had been worthwhile. But what she didn't realize as she rushed up the courthouse steps with her paperwork in hand was that those few minutes of lateness would set off a chain of events, ones that would expose deep-seated biases in a system she had never imagined. Confronting Judge Edward Grayson's courtroom awaited. Known for its strict rules and cold efficiency, Judge Grayson had spent 30 years on the bench, his reputation built on discipline and unwavering order. At 62, with graying hair and wire-rimmed eye glasses, He sat elevated above the room, his black robe crisp and pristine. The courtroom was already bustling. More than 20 individuals occupied the wooden benches, most there for minor matters, traffic violations, contract disputes, and administrative hearings. Grayson observed them with a practiced eye. Many, early arrivals were neatly dressed, their paperwork organized. He nodded in approval at their punctuality, and then the door swung open. Karoline stepped in, a few minutes late, and in that moment she had no idea that her tardiness, so out of character, would lead to an encounter that would challenge everything she thought she knew about fairness and authority. "All rise," the bailiff Robert Hayes called out as the session began. Judge Edward Grayson launched into his routine with practiced precision, swiftly working through the first few cases. He prided himself on running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. To him, punctuality was a sign of respect for the law, tardiness, an affront to it. So when the courtroom door swung open a few minutes after the session had started, he paused mid-sentence, his sharp gaze locking onto the young woman slipping inside. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice cold and clipped. Karoline Leavitt moved toward the podium, her posture composed despite the judge's glare. She was used to high-pressure environments, but the hostility in the air was unmistakable. Judge Grayson glanced down at his docket. "You must be Karoline Leavitt, scheduled for the start of this session." He emphasized the timing with deliberate disapproval. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than this court's, Miss Leavitt?" Before she could respond, he pressed on, his voice rising. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Just minutes earlier, a middle-aged businessman had arrived late, yet the judge had barely acknowledged it. "In this courtroom we have rules," Grayson continued, shuffling papers without once looking at her. "This isn't a White House press briefing or some media spectacle where you can stroll in at your convenience. This is a court of law." Karoline remained still, hands clasped in front of her, quietly observing. He hadn't even reviewed her paperwork. His disdain was evident in every clipped syllable, every dismissive gesture. She could see it clearly. He saw her as an entitled young woman, undeserving of deference. From his place near the bench, bailiff Robert Hayes, a court veteran of 15 years, watched the scene with a hint of unease. He'd seen this before. He knew how Grayson treated people who didn't fit his mold. "Your Honor, may I explain?" Karoline began, her voice steady. "You may not," Grayson cut in, silencing her. "I've heard every excuse. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergencies. None of it matters. This court starts on time." He lifted his gavel slightly, as if its mere presence reinforced his authority. Around the room, quiet glances were exchanged. A young woman in a business suit who had arrived just before Karoline sat unnoticed. Her lateness ignored. A pattern was emerging, though Grayson himself seemed oblivious to it. "This court will not tolerate disregard for procedure," he declared. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality." Karoline remained steadfast. She had faced dismissal before, skeptical journalists questioning her youth, political opponents undermining her role. But this was different. This was blatant. A display of unchecked power, unfolding in a place that was supposed to represent fairness. The tension in the room thickened. Other defendants watched with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. At the clerk's desk, Margaret Evans, a seasoned court administrator, hesitated as she transcribed the proceedings. She had worked with Grayson for years and had seen enough to recognize when something didn't sit right. Judge Grayson leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face cast in sharp shadows from the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Miss Leavitt," he declared, his voice ringing through the chamber, "this court hereby fines you $500 for contempt." A hush fell over the room. It was an unusually steep fine for mere tardiness. But Grayson didn't acknowledge that. Karoline stood motionless, her mind swiftly cataloging every detail: the dismissive tone, the lack of eye contact, the quiet hypocrisy. She had spent years in the political arena, honing her ability to recognize when power was being wielded unfairly. And now, standing in a courtroom meant to uphold justice, she saw it clearer than ever. At her desk, Margaret Evans typed the ruling into the system, her fingers hesitant. After 12 years in the courthouse, she rarely second-guessed her work. But something about this moment unsettled her enough to jot a private note in her log. Just last week, a middle-aged attorney had been late to court. Grayson had let it slide without a word. What the judge didn't realize as he prepared to move on was that his next words would set off a chain of events, ones that would challenge his authority in ways he never expected. The real shock of the morning was still to come. A middle-aged attorney had arrived 20 minutes late without explanation and received only a mild reprimand. Yet here Grayson stood, seemingly emboldened by Karoline's silence, pressing his authority. Let this serve as a lesson in responsibility. He lifted a sheet of paper, pretending to read from it, though it was clearly for show. The legal system runs on order and respect. Without punctuality, we'd have chaos. Among the onlookers, reactions varied. The young woman in the business suit checked her watch, recalling her own unnoticed delay. An elderly man in the back shook his head, all too familiar with Grayson's selective enforcement of rules. Bailiff Robert Hayes maintained his professional stance near the bench, but his jaw tightened. He had seen injustices like this before. In 15 years, he had never spoken up, but that didn't mean he hadn't noticed. Karoline inhaled slowly, deliberately. She had weathered tougher battles, fielding relentless questions in the White House press room, defending Trump against fierce political scrutiny. But this was different. This was personal, yet it stood for something greater than herself. She pulled out her phone, discreetly noting the fine's amount and details. Grayson wasn't finished. His tone sharpened, taking on the air of a strict schoolmaster. You will pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you late on that too, would we? A few nervous chuckles rose from the gallery but died quickly under the weight of the room's tension. The morning sun had shifted, now casting light directly on Karoline's face as she stood at the podium. She remained composed, but her eyes held a quiet defiance, one a wiser judge might have recognized as a warning. She had spent years honing her mind, late nights spent poring over legal documents alongside Trump's advisors, preparing for every scenario. And now, unwittingly, Grayson was handing her all the evidence she needed to expose his bias. Do you understand the fine as I've explained it? Grayson asked, his tone thick with expectation. When Karoline finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured. Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely. Each word was deliberate, each syllable controlled. She had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest response was to document everything and wait for the right moment. Grayson nodded, satisfied. He took her silence as submission, reached for the next case file, and prepared to move on, unaware that he had just handed her everything she needed. He didn't notice her meticulous record of his words. He didn't see her fingers swiftly typing a message to her White House team. He remained oblivious to the fact that his fleeting moment of unchecked authority was about to become something much bigger. Evidence. The courtroom remained tense as Grayson prepared to proceed. But Karoline wasn't done. In fact, she was just getting started. The moment she opened her briefcase, the air shifted. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its pages dense with notes from Trump campaign meetings. The morning light caught the fine print as she flipped through them. Grayson, already focused on the next case, assumed their exchange was over. He was mistaken. Your Honor. Karoline's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. The room froze. Before we proceed, I need to clarify something for the record. She lifted her notebook, its detailed legal precedents plainly visible. I am Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary, and though I am not here as a lawyer, I have more than enough legal knowledge to challenge this court's ruling. The effect was immediate. Grayson's face, flushed with authority moments earlier, drained of color. His hand, poised to turn the next page, stalled in midair. The silence was absolute. Even the soft hum of the ceiling fan now seemed deafening. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, stopped typing mid-sentence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Bailiff Robert Hayes, a man who rarely betrayed emotion, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. In 15 years he had seen plenty, but this moment, he would remember. Grayson opened his mouth, then hesitated. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at Karoline. Not just as some young woman, not just as a political figure, but as a professional standing before him, armed with knowledge and confidence that rivaled his own. Karoline continued, her voice steady. "I apologize for my delay this morning, Your Honor," she said. "I was handling an urgent matter from the White House regarding the Gulf of America's decree, which I assume Your Honor is familiar with." She let the words settle. "I have email confirmation from political advisor Michael Reynolds. I'm happy to provide it to the court if needed." The courtroom held its breath, and for the first time Judge Grayson found himself on the defensive. The woman who had arrived late earlier sank lower in her seat, feeling as if she were watching a courtroom drama unfold in real time. An elderly, local in the gallery, however, sat up straighter, a flicker of pride flashing in his eyes. This was a rare sight, one he hadn't expected to witness in his lifetime. Judge Edward Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it, his expression shifting, as he fumbled with the papers on his desk. For the first time that morning, he looked uncertain in his elevated chair. Miss Leavitt, He hesitated, glancing down, his usual air of control slipping. Karoline didn't allow him to regain his footing. "My role shouldn't matter, Your Honor," she interjected, her voice firm yet respectful. "What matters is fairness in applying the law." She placed her notebook on the podium and pulled out her phone. "I've noted several concerning points from this morning's proceedings, including the unequal treatment of defendants based on age and reputation." Grayson's face shifted from red to a faintly sickly green. As a municipal judge, he understood the implications of a figure like Karoline, sharp, meticulous, and connected to the White House, calling attention to his courtroom practices. His mind raced, re-evaluating the morning through a new lens. "Perhaps," he said hastily, "we could discuss this in chambers, and of course the fine is dismissed." "No, Your Honor." Karoline's voice carried the weight of every time she had faced dismissal in her career. "Dismissing the fine just because of who I am would only reinforce the bias I'm addressing. Instead, I believe this is an opportunity for a broader conversation about fairness in the law." A ripple of quiet awe spread through the room. Defendants who had been resigned to the system now sat up, some clutching their phones despite courtroom restrictions. This was a moment they would tell their children about. The day someone finally challenged the bias they had long felt, but rarely been able to prove. At her desk, Mrs. Margaret Evans typed faster than ever, determined to capture every word of this historic exchange. She had seen Grayson berate countless defendants over the years, but never had she witnessed such a precise and unshakable challenge to his authority. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the courtroom, like a stage. Grayson, seated high on his bench, seemed smaller now, his authority unraveling. Karoline, standing at the podium, was no longer just a defendant. She was a symbol of intellect and resilience. And everyone in that room knew it. The silence stretched, until Grayson cleared his throat, a feeble attempt to regain control. "Leavitt," he said, his voice noticeably softer. "Allow me to be the first to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." He pressed a button on his desk, summoning his clerk. "We'll strike this fine from the record at once." Karoline remained at the podium, upright and composed. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I respectfully decline to have the fine dismissed." A murmur spread through the room. "Instead, I'd like to address the larger issue at hand." The other defendants leaned forward, riveted. Mrs. Evans stopped typing entirely, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Caught in the moment. Bailiff Robert Hayes, usually the silent observer, edged closer to the center of the room, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. Karoline pulled out her phone, scrolling through her notes. "This morning," she continued, "I observed 7 people enter this courtroom after the session had begun. 3 were middle-aged professionals who received no reprimand. 2 were young students who were given verbal warnings, and 2, including myself, faced the harshest treatment." She paused. "The pattern is clear." Grayson's face reddened, again, though this time it was from embarrassment, not authority. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice faltering, What you're suggesting is a very serious accusation. I'm simply presenting the evidence, Your Honor, Karoline replied smoothly. And as someone working in the administration, I have a duty to report any bias in our legal system. She turned slightly, addressing the entire room now. In fact, I've already sent a detailed report on this morning's proceedings to my team at the White House. The room collectively inhaled. A young law student seated in the back scribbled furiously, knowing this was the kind of real-world legal moment that no textbook could teach. The elderly local who had been watching from the start wiped a tear from his eye, remembering his own past experiences with unfair treatment. Grayson, visibly rattled, gripped the arms of his chair. "And what exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his confidence eroding with every passing second. The sunlight streamed through the windows, no longer warm but stark, like an interrogation lamp bearing down on the judge himself. A determined beam settled on Karoline's face as she placed both hands on the podium. Her voice was clear, measured, and unwavering. "I propose 3 immediate actions, Your Honor." She raised one finger. "First, I will pay the $500 fine, not because it is just, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings." She raised a second finger. "Second, I request a formal review of the past 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom, with a focus on identifying patterns in how defendants are treated." Judge Grayson's face paled. "And third," Karoline continued, "I suggest mandatory bias awareness training for all court personnel, including the bench." A charged silence gripped the room. The air crackled with unspoken reactions. Mrs. Margaret Evans resumed typing, determined to capture every word. Across the room, Bailiff Robert Hayes gave the slightest nod. He had witnessed countless moments like this, ones that went unchallenged. This time was different. Grayson cleared his throat, his attempt to regain control thinly veiled. "These proposals," he began, "though well-intentioned, seem rather extreme for what is, at its core, a simple case of tardiness." Karoline met his gaze unshaken. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she responded, "what's extreme is the persistent pattern of bias in our courts. From my experience working with President Trump, I've seen how these small issues pile up into major barriers to justice." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a check. "I'll pay the fine now," she stated, her voice steady and free of resentment. "And my team will follow up regarding the court records." The morning sun poured through the courtroom windows, illuminating every corner. Grayson, seated high on his bench, no longer looked imposing. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. The story spreads. By late afternoon, the events in Grayson's courtroom had spread like wildfire through New Hampshire's legal and political circles. It started with a text message from the young law student who had witnessed it all. "Just saw the White House press secretary take down a judge in court. Unbelievable." Within minutes, the message circulated through study groups, legal forums, and political networks. At the White House, Karoline sat in her office reviewing documents related to the Gulf of America decree when her phone began buzzing nonstop. First came calls from political colleagues in New Hampshire, many sharing their own experiences with Judge Grayson. For years, they had stayed silent, fearing career consequences. "This isn't just about me," Karoline told David Parker, a Trump campaign advisor who had stopped by her office. "For every young person like me who faces this treatment, imagine how many everyday people suffer quietly." She turned her phone toward him, showing the growing flood of messages from politicians and journalists across the state. Meanwhile, in the break room of Plato Municipal Courthouse, Mrs. Margaret Evans sat with other court staff, her voice hushed but firm. "I've been keeping my own records," she admitted, pulling out a small notebook. "Every time I saw something off, I wrote it down. Dates, names, fines, everything." Her hands trembled slightly as she revealed the years of information she had kept secret. By early evening, local news stations had picked up the story. Jonathan Lee, a reporter for Channel 7 News, stood outside the courthouse, his crew setting up for a live segment. Sources inside the courthouse confirmed that the White House press secretary was fined $500 for arriving late this morning. he reported. But what happened next has sparked a statewide debate about bias in our legal system. The story exploded across social media. Hashtags like near Grayson bias and legal genius trended in New Hampshire. Former defendants shared their own experiences with Judge Grayson, many detailing instances of disproportionate punishments, particularly against younger individuals or those without legal representation. That evening, Grayson sat at home, watching the news with growing dread. His phone had been ringing incessantly, calls from fellow judges, the state judicial board, and reporters demanding comment. He had served on the bench for 30 years, but now his entire career was under scrutiny. At the White House, Karoline's office phone rang once more. This time it was Emily Carter, a prominent New Hampshire journalist. "We've been trying to document these biases for years," Emily said. "But coming from you, someone in the White House who has experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. Would you be willing to speak at a press conference tomorrow?" Back at the courthouse, staff were already pulling Grayson's old case records. As they sifted through them, whispered conversations spread. They had all known. Now the rest of the world did too. A system under scrutiny. As investigators combed through Judge Grayson's rulings, a troubling pattern emerged. One clerk discovered that, over the past year, younger defendants were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines than older ones for identical violations. By nightfall, national news outlets took notice. "New Hampshire judge faces scrutiny after fining White House press secretary," one headline read. "Unexpected legal talent shines in New Hampshire courtroom," another announced. On social media, discussions about age bias in the legal system exploded, with Karoline's experience serving as a prime example. Robert Hayes, the courtroom bailiff, fielded several calls from colleagues that evening. "We've all seen things like this," he told them. "The difference is, this time, someone with influence saw it too, and she didn't let it slide." As he spoke, he thought back to the many moments he had watched similar injustices unfold, powerless to intervene. A call to action late that night. Karoline sat in her home office, scrolling through the flood of messages she had received. Political organizations invited her to speak at events. Media outlets asked for her help in documenting similar cases. Law schools wanted her to guest lecture on confronting systemic bias. She opened her laptop and began drafting a formal report to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. This was no longer about one judge or one courtroom. It had become a catalyst for change, an opportunity to expose and reform a system that had long operated unchecked. As she typed, her phone buzzed. A message from a young law student appeared on the screen. "Thank you for showing us we can change the system from within. You've given us hope." The investigation begins a week after the courtroom incident. The New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee launched a formal investigation into Judge Edward Grayson. In a conference room on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building, lead investigator Laura Bennett spread dozens of files across a long wooden table. Her team worked tirelessly, analyzing thousands of cases spanning the past 5 years. The data was damning. "Look at these numbers," Laura told her team, pointing to a spreadsheet on her laptop. In minor contract disputes, defendants under 30 were fined an average of $400. Older defendants, just $120. For the same violations, she sighed, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. And that's just the beginning. A few doors down in a small interview room, Mrs. Margaret Evans sat with her hands clasped over a worn notebook. For 12 years, she had documented every troubling incident in Grayson's courtroom. Now, she finally had a chance to share them. "I noticed the pattern my first year as his clerk," she told investigators, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through her notes. "The way he spoke to people, his tone, his words, even how much time he gave them to explain themselves, it all depended on their age or status, uncovering the truth." The investigation expanded beyond fines. Investigators interviewed dozens of former defendants, attorneys, and court staff. Robert Hayes provided a handwritten statement detailing hundreds of incidents he had witnessed over his 15-year career. Some days I kept count of how often the judge interrupted younger defendants versus older ones, he wrote. The difference was staggering. Young defendants were interrupted 5 times more often. Meanwhile, at the White House, Karoline continued her routine work preparing media responses for President Trump. But her office had become a hub for those eager to share their own experiences. Young advisors brought forward case records. Community. Activists presented long-ignored complaints. Karoline scanned the growing pile of evidence on her desk. "We need to organize all this information," she told her assistant. "Every story matters. Every incident counts. This isn't just about one judge, it's about reshaping how we view justice." The system exposed, the deeper investigators dug, the more troubling the findings became. Young women received the highest fines on average. Cases involving defendants under 35 were processed 40% faster than those of older individuals, often at the cost of a fair hearing. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for younger defendants. Witnesses defending younger individuals were interrupted at significantly higher rates. Judge Grayson was summoned for questioning multiple times. As investigators confronted him with the data, his once confident demeanor faltered. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he murmured during one session, his voice quieter than usual. I didn't realize." For the first time, he seemed to grasp the weight of his actions. But the investigation didn't stop with him. As the team expanded their research, they discovered that several other judges in the region exhibited similar patterns in their rulings. What began as an inquiry into one judge's conduct had revealed a systemic issue, one that stretched far beyond Plato Municipal Court. By the end of the 3rd week, it was clear. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a reckoning. Laura Bennett and her team spent weeks compiling a comprehensive report. The final document, 300 pages long, was packed with statistics, testimonies, and a meticulous analysis of thousands of cases. The evidence was undeniable. "This report doesn't just highlight isolated incidents," Laura told the committee board, as she placed the hefty document on the conference table. "It reveals a systemic pattern of bias, one that has quietly shaped thousands of lives for years. More importantly, it shows how this bias operates so subtly that even those enforcing it may not fully recognize their actions." As the investigation neared its conclusion, one thing became clear. Karoline Leavitt's experience had not just exposed a single judge's misjudgment. It had pried open a door that had been sealed shut for decades, revealing years of unchecked discrimination and inequity. The question was no longer just about Judge Grayson's fate. It was about how to fix a system that had allowed such bias to thrive. The solution required more than discipline. It demanded a complete reimagining of justice in New Hampshire's courts. A new era for justice. 3 months after Karoline had stepped into Grayson's courtroom, the face of justice in Plato began to shift. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as workers installed a new sign, Center for Judicial Training and Fairness. Judge Grayson was no longer on the bench. After the investigation's findings were made public, he was given a choice: resign or face a public hearing. He chose resignation, but that wasn't the end of his story. In an unexpected turn, he became part of the solution. "I never saw my own bias," Grayson admitted, as he stood before a group of judges at the first mandatory judicial training session. His voice was humbler, his posture less rigid than before. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same. But I never examined how my own background and assumptions shaped my rulings." Karoline sat at the back of the training room, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't anticipated this outcome when she stood up in that courtroom months ago. Beside her sat Mrs. Margaret Evans, now promoted to lead a new court monitoring program. The changes rippled beyond one courthouse. New rules required courts to track and publicly report fine disparities and sentencing trends. An independent committee, composed of legal experts, activists, and community members, was established to review judicial conduct. Robert Hayes, the longtime courtroom bailiff, was appointed to lead a training program for court staff. "We are the eyes and ears of the courtroom," Hayes told his first class of trainees. It's our duty to speak up when we see unfairness. The days of staying silent are over. At the White House, Karoline framed her $500 fine receipt on the wall, a symbol of the moment that sparked real change. Below it, she hung a new photo, herself with a group of law students. Now she taught a weekly class on ethics and bias in IDI, the legal system. The State Bar Association followed suit, launching a new reporting system for bias incidents in the courts. In its first month, it received over 200 reports, each one investigated, each one adding to a growing call for reform. It's not just about punishing wrongdoing, Karoline told a reporter during an interview. It's about changing how we think about justice. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves respect regardless of age, gender, or role. A ripple effect. The impact wasn't confined to Plato. Other New Hampshire cities began implementing similar reforms: mandatory bias awareness training for judges and court staff, regular audits of rulings to ensure fairness, community oversight committees to monitor courtroom practices, standardized guidelines for fines and sentencing to prevent disparities. Law schools also made changes, adding mandatory diversity and ethics training to their curriculum. One morning, 3 months after the incident, Karoline received a letter. It too was from the young law student who had witnessed everything that day in court. That moment changed my career path, the student wrote. I now focus on social justice law. You showed me that change is possible. It just takes one person willing to stand up and say this isn't right. Attached was a photo of the student's new legal clinic, dedicated to helping those facing courtroom discrimination. Meanwhile, an elderly man, the same one who had sat in court that day, returned to visit the courthouse. As he walked through the halls, he noticed the changes: multilingual signs welcoming visitors, a help desk offering free legal guidance, security, guards greeting every person equally, regardless of status. His eyes welled up. I've been coming here for 40 years, he told a young clerk at the desk. This is the first time I've felt justice might truly be fair. A legacy of change. Karoline's phone buzzed with a new message. The Judicial Review Board wanted her to lead a statewide commission on court reform. As she read the request, she thought back to that morning in the courtroom, when a simple act of standing up for what was right had sparked a wave of change that was still growing. In the courthouse's main lobby, a new plaque was installed. Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat every person who walks through these doors. Below the inscription was the date Karoline Leavitt stepped into Edward Grayson's courtroom. The day everything changed.